Welcome back to Full Court Press with Sean Spicer here, your Sunday morning on WABC. A lot going on with the economy, especially when it comes to Iran. I'm excited to welcome into the show for the first time. But then again, I mean, the show's kind of new, so I don't know. But longtime guest on my evening show, the Heritage Foundation's own EJ Antoni. EJ, good to hear from you. How are you?
Sean, I'm doing well. Pleasure to be back with you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, you know, you do so well on the show, on the Sean Spicer show, that we got to bring you into the ABC family here. I got to just start with this. There's a military strategy in Iran, and I'll leave that up to, General Kane and Secretary Hegseth, et cetera. But the economic impact of it, I think, is something that every American is kind of looking at, because you had the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, a week ago say that he could expect $3 gas between June and September. And then Secretary Chris Wright, the Energy Secretary, saying by the end of the year, which seems a little bit longer of a runway. To be blunt, I found it interesting that both would say that at all. I mean, if you're like the Treasury, the energy guy, like saying something that is clearly impacted by the military people, I'm not sure I would make predictions. But what do you see the reality of $3 gas being?
Sean, great question. And look, I think you're absolutely right that so many Americans are, they're right to feel the way that they do, basically, regardless of whatever the military or geopolitical situation is. At the end of the day, each American has to deal with what's going on at home and with their own family budget every single month. So when is that budget going to get better in terms of $3 gasoline? Here's the big problem. It's entirely out of our hands at this point. It depends on what is Iran going to do? What is Israel going to do? What are other actors, not only in the region, but around the world, like China and Russia, going to do? And the situation, I hate to say it, but from an economic standpoint, has kind of spiraled out of control at this point. So that, again, a lot of this is simply out of our hands right now until the strait is actually back open and you get that supply of oil flowing again. You're going to continue to see fuel prices stay stubbornly high. And there's just nothing we can do about that in the short run. And part of this, by the way, I think is the Biden administration's fault. For 4 years, they were really kneecapping our oil industry, and now we don't have any excess capacity.
Well, okay, I got a few things to ask you about this. I mean, number one, even if if we come to a deal, which I'm not hopeful for, right? The folks that I talk to in the sort of the maritime domain say that this is all predicated on the insurers, right? They're the ones who are saying to Maersk, MSC, et cetera, like whether we will insure your crew, your cargo, your ship. And there are a lot of mines out there that they want to see swept to make sure that there are no dangers, right? And that the Iranian small boat attacks. So the people I talk to, EJ, say that at the best case scenario, we're talking probably 10 days out. I know that there was some reporting that the Pentagon said it would be months. If that's the case, meaning that the reason I'm bringing this up is, like, let's say you get a deal that the sweeping and the safety of transit is still probably weeks after that. And that would then impact all this economic stuff.
Well, exactly. And so all of that is 100% correct. But there are even more lags that we want to factor in here, Sean. For example, when you're looking at oil infrastructure, these are not pieces of equipment that you can shut on and off like a light switch. These are things that have incredibly long lead times. In other words, if I want to turn on a refinery or even just some drilling equipment, oftentimes even under emergency procedures, you're looking at weeks to turn these things off or on. And so when I'm trying to make the decision, do I want to turn on this piece of equipment? I'm not just asking, is the strait open right now, but am I confident it will still be open 2 or 3 weeks from now? Because that's when I'll actually have product flowing trying to get through the strait. So again, it's not just a matter of the strait's got to get open, but then we have to have confidence that it's going to be open in the near future. So you need both of those things to happen. And even still, now you're talking about the oil has to get through the strait. It's got to get around the world to different locations, whether that's here in the United States or Europe, Asia, you name it, right? All of these things are going to take time. It will be a while before the strait is actually open and then we see any kind of relief at the pump.
Okay, and that was sort of my next thing. So let's just say, if you say day zero being the day that there's a deal and it's swept, like I remember when this thing happened, right? The prices, I think I was paying like $2.98, $3.05 a gallon, and suddenly it's like quick up. What should we expect as consumers for how quick it goes down?
Unfortunately, the example a lot of people like to use is that gas prices go up on an elevator, they come down on an escalator. And there's a lot of reasons for that economically. I know the left will say, oh, they're gouging consumers. No, there genuinely are a lot of economic reasons for that. But to answer your question, Sean, you're looking at probably a couple of months before you see the full impact. And the other thing is, I know a lot of people have said prices will be back down to where they were before the war. Let's look at a best case scenario. Okay. Best case scenario, Iran lets crude and everything through the strait. They don't impose any tolls or anything like that. And you get relatively free shipping. You're not going to get the same level of shipments. You're not going to have the same supply that you did before the war, because at this point, oil infrastructure in the region has been damaged or destroyed. That represents supply that will be offline for several years. That's just one example. There's a gas field in Qatar that is going to be offline for 3 to 5 years before they can get it fully repaired and back up to its previous operating capacity. So prices will go down because supply will go up, but supply won't go up to quite where it was before, which means prices will not go down quite to where they were before.
That's not what I wanted to hear. Okay, but let's pivot for a second. You were talking about the supply in the Biden administration. When you hear the president talk, he says, we got plenty of oil here in America. And again, just you explain to me from an economic standpoint, why can't we, someone has said to me before, why don't we just have an export ban and say, okay, all the stuff that's made here, we take care of ourselves, the price goes down. What's the harm in that?
Sean, this is such a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. So we have this kind of notion that all crude oil is created equal, right? It's right. Not. There are lots of different types of crude. And when you have a refinery, you need to set it up to optimally refine a specific type of crude. If you wanted to just refine anything and everything, it's going to actually be incredibly inefficient. Imagine if you had an engine in your car that could run off of diesel, it could run off of rubbing alcohol, it could run off of gasoline. Sure, you could do that, but it's going to be incredibly inefficient. So we optimize our refineries. A lot of the refineries we have in this country were built at a time when we were importing heavy sour crude. In other words, it's thicker, it's got a higher sulfur content, etc. Now, today, with the fracking revolution, we get a lot of light sweet crude in this country. So we end up importing. We're actually a net importer of crude. If you're just looking at crude oil, we are still a net importer. We import a lot of crude from abroad, refine it, use it here, but we also export a ton of refined products. And a lot of the oil that we get out of the ground here, Sean, we don't even refine here. A lot of it actually gets sent abroad. Now, once you include not just crude, but all of the refined products that come out of crude, that's where we become a big net exporter. So it's not just a matter of, well, we have enough here, we're self-sufficient, we don't need to be conducting any of this international trade in the oil market. No, we actually do. And that's something a lot of folks really miss in this discussion.
Get the most out of your vehicle with GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco Original Equipment. The only parts designed, engineered, tested, and backed by General Motors. You can find your perfect fit for most makes and models and choose from 3 tiers of parts, including GM OE or gold and silver aftermarket parts. Visit gmparts.com for more information.
It's so fascinating because, again, I think sometimes, and I fall victim to this myself, EJ, which is you hear, oh, it's just easy. We've got plenty of oil. But it's like, you think about the gas or the oil you put in your lawnmower, for example, right? It's like 2-stroke oil, and then the point you put in your car, it's like it's not all created equal. And so therefore, when you hear this kind of stuff, but do you think that, like, from what you understand, I am of the mindset that the only way you get a deal in Iran is militarily. Like this notion of the blockade and squeezing them economically will yield a result. I'm just not convinced that that's the answer.
Sean, again, really good question here. I'm a bit outside my lane when we get too much into the military stuff. At the end of the day, I'm a monetary scientist, not a political scientist. So, the geopolitics here is a bit beyond me, I will admit. What I can tell you, though, just again, strictly from the economic perspective, is that all of these countries, whether it's Iran, whether it's Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, you name it, these are all countries that are incredibly dependent on their energy exports and have insanely high cash flows. That's why the Fed and the Treasury are talking about conducting currency swaps right now to basically give these countries a bunch of dollars that they'll exchange at a future date back for their regular currencies, because they normally have such insanely high dollar flows because they're constantly selling so much energy to the rest of the world. And most of these transactions are usually done in dollars. So it is definitely hurting Iran. There is no doubt about it economically. We're definitely putting the hurt on them. However, at the same time, you're putting the hurt on the rest of the world as well. Obviously, you're doing it here at home, right? Look at what's happened to oil prices. And although it may seem like it's not a big price to pay, you have to remember that the oil crisis, Sean, is very apparent right now, because every week when we go to fill up at the pump, it hits us in the face. What is less apparent are things like the fertilizer crisis. Most people are completely unaware it's happening, but it is. You shut off a fifth of the world's fertilizer supply, just like you shut off a fifth of the world's oil supply with this whole conflict. And the difficulty there is that it's not going to actually hit consumer food prices until September, October, roughly that time in the autumn. So it is coming. We are going to see additional food price inflation this year because of this. It just hasn't shown up yet. And so people are not very aware that it's happening.
Okay. So what impact is this going to, I mean, you mentioned fertilizer and all of it. Like, if this drags on, and like I said, I would love to see a quick victory, right? I mean, that's just, and I think you do too. But I don't see it. So let's just say that this takes a couple more months. What impact will this have inflationary wise or on our prices, like day to day? Are we going to start to see goods and services beyond gasoline tick up?
Well, Sean, think about when you go to the grocery store and you grab a gallon of milk off the shelf, or your carton of a dozen eggs, or even forget grocery store, you go to a hardware store, you buy a box of nails, literally anything. Whenever you go to a store and you grab something off the shelf, how did it get there? It got there on a truck. Yeah. Right. What I'm getting at, Sean, is that the higher transportation costs that this conflict is causing is going to put upward pressure on prices throughout the entire economy. Look, this is exactly what we saw under Biden, and it's a big reason why inflation came down so quickly in the first year of the Trump administration. In fact, Sean, there were a lot of prices that we've been tracking very, very closely that they actually stopped going up entirely, and some of them had actually started going down at the very beginning of this year. In other words, January and February, and by all metrics, they should have continued going down for the rest of the year. But sadly, that progress has now stopped and is being reversed. And so the longer the conflict drags on for, the more you're going to see those upward pressures on prices throughout the economy. Again, it's shockingly very much a repeat of what happened during the Biden years, where their war against American energy caused upward price pressure, not just on energy, but everything else too.
It's funny. I saw a liberal media host, I like to call them personalities, not journalists, ask a guest the other day, to your point, doesn't this make the case that we should do what Biden was doing and invest in like wind and solar?
Oh, dear goodness, yes. And what is that doing for electricity prices today, right? Why electricity prices have been going up. And it's not because of the conflict with Iran. The increase in electricity prices predates that. What happened was you had so much wind and solar added to the grid, which is very, very expensive way to produce electricity, that it's been driving up electricity prices. People think it's all about, data centers and the increase in demand. Yes, there has been some increase in demand because of data centers. There's no doubt about it. But it's been the much bigger impact has been the shrinking of supply. You're adding unreliable and expensive energy sources to the grid. So of course your electricity prices are going to go up. Do you want it to go up even further? Okay, well then add more wind and solar to the grid and keep reducing coal and nuclear and natural gas capacity.
Can I just, for the record, I just want to make sure I get your take on this, because I don't really care. Like, if you want to put solar panels on your roof, right? I don't care. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. I do think windmills are stupid. And frankly, the ones out in the water do more damage to maritime life than they do good. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make, and I would love you to weigh in this as an economist, EJ, is like, if somebody wants to be a do-gooder and use renewables, that's fine. It's just, you have to understand the limits.
Sure. And the other thing, Sean, is that if you want to put solar panels on your house, I have no problem with that. It's your house. You can do whatever you want with it. But here's the thing, Sean. I want you to pay for it. I don't want to. But also, I just want to be clear. I guess I should have reframed that a little bit better. My point is, it's one thing if you want to do it. Like, I grew up in Rhode Island, and the monks at my school put up a windmill, right? And it made them feel very good. That's fine. But I think my point is, I want people to understand that's one thing for you to do on your property with your money. It's quite another to use this as a strategy. We saw this down in Texas. That, like, if I don't want my taxpayers going all in on a strategy that's not going to yield us anything. Right. And Sean, the only point that I really want to emphasize here is the fact that right now you are paying for the solar panels on your neighbor's house. They are heavily, heavily subsidized by the taxpayer. And the reason for that is because without those subsidies, they would be prohibitively expensive. In other words, they'd be a net loser. You would never recoup the cost of those solar panels during their lifetimes. That's why you have to have these massive government subsidies for these things. It's not just the huge windmill farms that you see blotting our landscape now across America, but even just the solar panels that you see for residential applications are heavily, heavily subsidized.
EJ, in the few minutes that we have left, I want your take. Kevin Warsh, the nominee to take over the Fed, was up on Capitol Hill this week. He got asked whether he'd be a human sock puppet. It was whatever. But what I want to ask you is that, like, let's just say, and make for the sake of conversation, that he gets the votes to be confirmed. What should his first act be? In other words, the president has been very clear he wants interest rates cut. I asked Steve Moore this the other day. Is that the smart policy in terms of what we need to keep the economy moving forward, to create jobs, but also as a check on inflation?
Good question, Sean. So it's the short answer is it depends. If he can do several other things, then cutting rates is going to be possible without causing inflation. One of the big things, and he's been talking a lot about this to his credit, one of the big problems at the Fed has been the massive growth in the Fed's balance sheet. So they've been purchasing all of these financial assets, which has been a boom to the stock market and to the big banks, right? They have made a killing off of the Fed's growth of the balance sheet, but it stuck the rest of us with inflation. So what he wants to do is start selling off that balance sheet, reducing the size of the Fed's asset holdings, which will put downward pressure on inflation. And that gives him the room to cut interest rates without causing that inflationary bubble. So if you can do those two things together, I think it would be the perfect mix. In other words, it's the exact opposite of what the Fed has been doing, where they grow the balance sheet too much and then they raise interest rates and crush Main Street. However, here's kind of the fly in the ointment, so to speak. You have to get government spending down. The reason for that is because right now all marginal spending by the government is borrowed, and that means the Treasury is trying to auction off, they're trying to sell Treasury debt. Well, they're going to be doing that at the same time the Fed is trying to sell its Treasury debt, and that can cause a whole host of other problems as well. So again, it's yes, you can lower interest rates, but you got to be doing those asset sales, and we got to get our federal government's fiscal house in order.
Okay. EJ, thanks for joining us on the Sunday. EJ Antoni from the Heritage Foundation, guys, giving us the inside scoop on where the economy is and headed. All right, when we return, Virginia State Party Chairman John Ryer is going to join us. Monday, there is a critical Virginia Supreme Court case coming down the pike about whether or not this election that stole 4 congressional seats for the Democrats will stand. He's going to give us the inside scoop on what we can expect and where we stand with the finger pointing. That's right after the break. You're listening to Full Court Press with Sean Spicer here on WABC. We'll be right back.